They thought walking away from you would cost them nothing, that you'd suffer in silence while they thrived. But Stoicism reveals a harsher truth. When someone violates trust, it's not you who falls apart, it's them. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow, but slowly, silently, life begins to turn. And what they once took for granted, your calm, your presence, your loyalty, becomes their greatest loss. You didn't need revenge. You didn't need to expose them. Because karma doesn't shout, it whispers. And in time, it reveals what betrayal truly costs, not in rage or drama, but in the quiet devastation of losing someone who was once their sanctuary. This isn't just a story of survival. It's a lesson in Stoic strength, emotional clarity, and why your silence speaks louder than vengeance ever could. Part 1. The betrayal that was meant to break you, but didn't. They thought betraying you would destroy you. That you'd come undone the moment they left, unraveling in silence, haunted by their absence. What they didn't realize was that their betrayal wasn't the end of you, it was the beginning of something far more powerful, your transformation. The pain was real, you didn't deny it. It came like a quiet storm, not loud, not chaotic, but heavy. Not everyone saw it, but you carried it. You felt it in the pit of your stomach and in the stillness of your nights. Betrayal is personal not because someone left, but because they looked you in the eye while doing it. And that's what cuts the deepest. Betrayal doesn't come from enemies. It comes from those you once protected. The people you let in when your defenses were down. That's why it feels like a form of psychological violence. You weren't just hurt, your reality was distorted. Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, reminds us that if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. This is not a call to numbness, but to clarity. The betrayal wasn't your failure, it was their inability to honor what you gave freely, trust. But what happens when you shift your perspective from pain to process? That's when the Stoic transformation begins. You didn't lash out, you didn't try to get even. Instead, you sat with it, you observed it, and slowly you learned how to use it. The Stoics never promised a life without suffering, only that we could suffer with strength. You see, the world teaches you to react, to scream, to burn bridges, to expose, but Stoicism teaches the opposite. That your greatest power lies not in retaliation, but in restraint, in the discipline to stay calm when chaos circles your name. Look at someone like Nelson Mandela, betrayed by his own nation, imprisoned for decades, humiliated and stripped of everything. And yet he emerged not bitter, but composed, even forgiving. He did not return violence with violence or betrayal with revenge. He returned as a statesman, a man of grace and principle. Why? Because he had transformed betrayal into clarity, into purpose. And you too are capable of this internal revolution. Think back to that moment, the conversation, the silence, the look in their eyes. Maybe they didn't even offer a goodbye, just a withdrawal of affection, a vanishing act that left you suspended in confusion. That's what betrayal does. It hijacks your sense of self-worth. You start to wonder if you were too much or not enough. But let's be honest, the fact that you loved deeply, that you showed up, that you stood beside someone who would eventually vanish, that's not a weakness. It's your strength. Betrayal doesn't reveal your flaws, it reveals theirs. It tells you who was never capable of holding what you offered. And perhaps the greatest illusion you carried was the belief that loyalty guarantees safety. It doesn't. Loyalty is not a shield. It's a gift, and not everyone deserves it. Epictetus once said, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our opinions about them." The betrayal doesn't destroy you unless you let it define you. And that's the critical Stoic pivot. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" ask, "What is this trying to teach me?" Because here's the deeper truth. When they left, they thought they were taking something from you, your peace, your identity, your worth. But in reality, they were giving you something, the opportunity to build a foundation that no one could ever shake again. That's the paradox. In breaking your heart, they freed your mind. And in that moment, when you didn't respond, when you didn't beg, didn't chase, didn't argue, something inside you shifted. That silence wasn't weakness. It was the first act of reclaiming your dignity. And for those who feed on chaos, your silence is unbearable. They can't manipulate what they can't provoke. Remember this, the same person who smiled while betraying you is often the same person who will one day be haunted by your silence. Because your absence, once they finally recognize it, becomes louder than anything you could have ever said. This is not revenge, this is rebirth. Part 2, why their absence sparked your awakening. There's a strange kind of grief that comes with being betrayed, not the explosive grief that arrives with finality, like death or catastrophe, but something more subtle, more insidious. It's not a storm that breaks the windows of your life all at once. It's a quiet erosion, slow and corrosive. It wears you down in invisible ways. You don't cry out, you doubt. You stare at the ceiling at 3 a.m. and ask yourself questions you never thought you'd ask. Was any of it real? Was I blind? Or worse, was I complicit in my own undoing? This grief is not about loss of the person. It's the loss of the version of yourself that trusted them. The person you were when you laughed in their company, when you let your guard down, when you gave the benefit of the doubt. That part of you now feels foreign, naive, exposed. You start to review the past like a crime scene. Every smile becomes suspect, every memory gets stained by doubt, and in that haze, even your instincts feel unreliable. This is where Stoicism steps in, not with denial, not with cold detachment, but with clarity. The Stoics never promised immunity from pain. On the contrary, they believed that pain, especially the moral kind, the kind that shakes the soul, was a sacred invitation to transformation. Seneca wrote, "No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself." And betrayal, that is adversity in its most intimate form. When you are betrayed, you are not simply dealing with emotional injury. You are confronting the collapse of your inner map, your judgment, your discernment, your moral compass. That's why it feels so destabilizing. The world doesn't just hurt, it no longer makes sense. And in a culture that equates confidence with certainty, this internal confusion can feel like weakness. But to the Stoic, this moment is not weakness, it is awakening. You are being forced to reforge your understanding of the world, this time not from blind trust, but from wisdom. Marcus Aurelius reminds us, "If someone is able to show me that what I think or do is not right, I will happily change, for I seek the truth, by which no one was ever truly harmed." That's the Stoic way, not to avoid discomfort, but to meet it, to wrestle with it, and to allow it to reshape you into something stronger, clearer, more aligned with reality. This is regeneration, not in the way the world encourages. Bounce back, get revenge, prove them wrong. No, Stoic regeneration is quieter, slower. It is the rebuilding of trust, but this time not outward, inward. It is the process of learning to trust yourself again, your perception, your boundaries, your instincts, and that takes time, because emotional wounds are not healed through denial or distraction. They are healed through stillness. Through a courageous pause where you stop trying to fix the narrative and instead begin to sit with the broken pieces. You examine the pattern, not the person. You study your response, not just their betrayal. This is the fertile soil where wisdom grows. Modern psychology supports this Stoic principle. Betrayal trauma, especially in close relationships, impacts our neurobiology in similar ways to physical injury. It shakes the limbic system, clouds our ability to regulate emotion, and can cause us to second-guess ourselves. But here's what's powerful. Neuroplasticity shows that with conscious intention, reflection, journaling, stillness, boundary building, we can retrain the brain to feel safe again, to feel whole again. That's the work of regeneration. And while the world demands reaction, post about it, expose them, get even, the Stoic resists this urgency. Not because they're passive, but because they understand a deeper law. The best revenge is not punishment, it's transformation. You don't need to make them hurt. Life has already begun that process. Your job is to rise above the wreckage and make something out of it. So yes, betrayal erodes, but erosion can also reveal. It strips away what was never stable to begin with. It removes the rust. It exposes the fault lines. And in its wake, you are offered a sacred question: what will I build in its place? And the answer, if you listen closely, is simple. Not bitterness, not vengeance, but strength, stillness, self-respect. The grief may not vanish quickly, but with each passing day it becomes less of a weight and more of a guide, less of a scar and more of a signal. And eventually it leads you right back to yourself, wiser, quieter, and ready to begin again. Part 3, when the pain becomes the teacher, a Stoic response to broken trust. By now you've probably realized something powerful, something that didn't arrive in a single cinematic moment, but unfolded gradually, like morning fog lifting from a valley. When you finally stopped explaining yourself, when you no longer felt compelled to defend your intentions, to rewrite history in your favor, or to prove your worth to people who never truly saw you, you felt something shift, something deep. Something sacred. The chaos didn't vanish from the outside world, the noise didn't stop, the betrayals weren't undone. But something else, something even more important, did begin to quiet the storm inside you, and that stillness. That wasn't emptiness, that was clarity returning to the center of your life. It's a subtle transformation, so subtle you might have missed it if you weren't paying attention. One day you woke up and realized you didn't feel the need to respond to every misinterpretation. You didn't burn with the urgency to make others understand your side. You no longer rehearsed imaginary conversations in your head where you said all the right things, where you finally made them get it. You stopped seeking redemption from the very people who delighted in doubting you. And in that pause, in that gentle withdrawal from the battlefield of constant explanation, you discovered a kind of power that is invisible to most, a power the Stoics have been teaching for over 2,000 years. The strength of inner control. Marcus Aurelius said, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul." That's not just poetic, it's profoundly practical. Because when you live your life depending on others to validate your character, your motives, your goodness, you're living in a prison. A mental and emotional prison where your peace is held hostage by someone else's ability or willingness to understand you. But when you take that power back, when you choose silence over justification, serenity over reactivity, you break the contract of emotional dependency. You end the toxic cycle of trying to prove your worth to people who are invested in never seeing it. Understand this: the people who most often demand explanations are rarely the ones willing to grow from them. Some people ask questions only to keep you on trial, to keep you small, to keep you begging for approval they never intend to give. And every time you try to explain your heart to someone who has already judged you, you hand them the blueprint of your emotional wiring. You give them a map to all your insecurities. And if they're manipulative, they'll use it not to understand you, but to control you. This is why the Stoics placed such high value on indifference, not as apathy, but as clarity. Epictetus said, "If evil be spoken of you and it be true, correct yourself. If it be a lie, laugh at it." You don't need to fight every accusation. You don't need to correct every misperception. Not every criticism is your responsibility, and not every misunderstanding is worth the oxygen it would take to correct it. Because here's the secret: the people who genuinely care about you don't need an explanation. They ask because they want to understand, not because they want ammunition. And the people who want ammunition, you could explain yourself perfectly and they would still twist it, still distort it, still make you out to be the villain in a story they wrote before they even heard your side. So what happens when you go quiet? At first, it feels like loss, like defeat, like walking away from a battle you trained for your entire life. But then it starts to feel like peace. You begin to realize that your energy, your presence, is a currency. one that doesn't need to be spent recklessly on people who treat you like an emotional vending machine. You learn to conserve your power, to hold your voice for spaces that deserve it, to use your words not to prove your value but to express your truth. And the more you practice this restraint, not from fear but from discernment, the more unshakable you become. You stop negotiating with chaos, you stop dancing with dysfunction, you stop watering relationships that only grow resentment. This is what real Stoic strength looks like, not explosive, not reactive, but anchored, composed. Rooted in something deeper than approval. You no longer have to be loud to be heard. You no longer have to be understood to feel at peace. You no longer have to explain your boundaries. They are evident in the way you move, in the way you protect your space, in the way you do not return to what broke you. And yes, people will notice. Some will mock your silence because they mistake it for weakness. Some will panic because they relied on your explanations to maintain control. And others will resent it because your stillness forces them to sit in their own discomfort without you there to cushion it. But those aren't your burdens anymore. Your silence is no longer a weapon. It's a boundary. It's a declaration. I don't need to be seen as right, I just need to be at peace. And from that space, from that calm, untroubled retreat within, you can begin to build a life that no longer rises and falls based on other people's narratives. You can finally come home to yourself. Part 4, the unseen power of walking away without a word. There's something profoundly unsettling for them about your evolution, not because you gloated, not because you sought revenge, but because you became someone they can no longer reach, no longer predict, no longer use. They once had a blueprint, an intimate knowledge of your emotional switches. They knew exactly what to say to make you doubt yourself. They could twist your kindness into weakness, your empathy into obligation. You were the one who apologized first, the one who over-explained, the one who forgave too easily and held the door open too long. But now they stand outside knocking, and the silence that answers them, that's what haunts them most. Because for people who thrive on control, your peace is not just confusing, it's terrifying. They didn't expect your healing to look like this. Quiet, composed, unbothered. They thought healing meant proving them wrong. They thought you'd come back louder, angrier, desperate to make them see what they lost. But instead you vanished, not out of vengeance, but out of alignment. You stopped playing a game that only made you bleed, and now they realize they have no entry point, no emotional leverage, no script to follow. You became unreadable, not because you hid yourself, but because you reclaimed yourself. This is what the Stoics called revenge without retaliation. Not the kind that requires an audience or applause, but the kind that happens in the quiet chambers of the soul, a restructuring, a remembering. You didn't chase karma, you became your own. As Epictetus once wrote, don't explain your philosophy, embody it. You didn't post cryptic quotes. You didn't share passive-aggressive messages. You didn't need to, because the most powerful revenge was never in your words, it was in your evolution. You see, for someone who depended on your emotional reactions to validate their importance, your stillness is unbearable. Because it leaves them with the one person they've spent their life avoiding, themselves. When you were reactive, they had something to grip onto, your anger, your confusion, your attempts to fix what they kept breaking. But when you went silent, you took that fuel away. Suddenly they're left with the echo of their own actions. No one to blame, no one to bait, no one to distract them from their emptiness. And so, the tables turn. Not because you flipped them, but because you stepped away. This is where Stoicism separates itself from modern self-help narratives that preach revenge disguised as empowerment. Stoicism doesn't celebrate payback, it teaches endurance. Integrity, the long view of justice, not the courtroom kind, but the cosmic kind. The justice that says, let time be the judge, let consequence be the teacher, and let me walk away with clean hands. Because here's what they never saw coming, your absence wasn't passive, it was surgical. It cut off their supply. Their drama couldn't survive in your silence. Their manipulation couldn't grow in your boundaries. Their superiority complex couldn't thrive without your validation. And while they tried to erase you from their story, they didn't realize that your absence would become the most persistent character in theirs. Your absence is not empty space. It's a mirror that reflects every part of themselves they projected onto you. A mirror they can't smash because you're no longer holding it. A mirror that doesn't lie and doesn't flinch. This is the unseen revenge of Stoicism. Not retaliation, transformation. You didn't drag their name through the mud. You cleaned your own house. You didn't waste energy trying to expose them. You used it to build something they can't access, a version of you that they no longer recognize and, worse, can no longer reach. And what they feel now isn't guilt, it's displacement. They don't miss you. They miss the control they had over you. They miss the version of you that was pliable, explainable, available, but you've risen. And your new altitude doesn't allow for that kind of turbulence. In this elevation, you don't need to defend your peace. It speaks for itself. You don't need to protect your name. Time does that. You don't need to win the narrative. You are the narrative shift, and so, while they may appear unchanged on the outside, laughing, posting, pretending, they are, in private, haunted by the quiet collapse of the illusion they built, the illusion that they would always have access to you. But now they see access is earned, and you've closed the door not out of cruelty but out of wisdom, because you learned something the hard way. Being reachable isn't the same as being available. Your new life isn't built on proving you've moved on. It's built on the fact that you don't have to prove anything at all. That's what truly unsettles them. That while they were preoccupied with erasing you, they didn't notice you were already becoming someone new. Someone unshakable, someone untouchable, someone who rose without needing to be seen. And now that evolution speaks louder than any argument ever could. Part 5, your calm is their collapse, why growth triggers guilt. You've crossed a threshold now, the kind that's invisible from the outside but unmistakable within. It's not marked by fireworks or applause. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic closure, no neat bow tied around the story. Instead, what marked your transition was quieter, deeper, irreversible. You stepped into the place where pain becomes power, not because you pretended it didn't hurt, not because you suppressed the memories, minimized the damage, or masked the sorrow behind toxic positivity, but because you refined it. You turned it over in your hands, you studied its texture, you let it speak, and then you chose what to do with it, and that choice made all the difference. This is where Stoicism parts ways with avoidance, with repression, with false strength. You didn't numb the betrayal, you didn't chant affirmations to drown it out. You faced it honestly, bravely, and with discipline. You sat in the ashes of what was. You acknowledged the wreckage. You didn't rush to rebuild or escape or rewrite the narrative. Instead, you asked the hardest questions. What did this reveal about them? But more importantly, what did this reveal about me? Because that's where transformation begins, not in blaming, but in understanding. Not in obsessing over why someone hurt you, but in examining why it shook you so deeply. And that takes courage, the kind most people avoid their entire lives. Seneca once wrote, "A gem cannot be polished without friction, nor a man perfected without trials." The friction here wasn't just the betrayal itself, it was your response to it, the nights you couldn't sleep, the times your mind rehashed every detail, the moments you doubted your own worth, your own sanity. That friction was real and necessary. Because what you were polishing wasn't your persona, it was your character. You weren't just recovering, you were refining. You learned how to sit in discomfort without running from it, how to name your pain without becoming it, how to hold space for your sorrow and still move forward with dignity. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, your pain began to change form. This is what the alchemists meant by transmutation. And this is where Stoicism becomes more than a philosophy, it becomes a lived experience. A forge, a crucible. You learned to observe your pain without being consumed by it. You didn't react, you reflected. You didn't collapse, you examined. You became a quiet student of your own suffering, and in doing so, you discovered a strength that isn't loud but unmovable, not dramatic but unwavering. This is Stoicism in its purest form, not the denial of pain but the domestication of it. The ability to look life in the eye, take what it gives you, and say, "This will shape me, but it will not shatter me." You started to see patterns of how you overextended yourself, how you ignored red flags in the name of love or loyalty, how you held on to people who were already letting go. And instead of using that awareness to berate yourself, you used it to evolve, not bitterly, but wisely. That's the difference. Many people get hurt and build walls. You built boundaries. They become hard. You became clear. Because you understood something vital. Pain is inevitable, but suffering is often a choice. And that suffering usually comes not from the betrayal itself, but from clinging to illusions. The illusion that people will love us the way we love them. That loyalty will be mutual. That being good means will be spared from harm. When those illusions shatter, it hurts. But what's left afterward is truth, and from truth comes real strength. You stopped asking why they hurt you. You started asking, what am I meant to do now with this scar? And that's when everything began to change. You turned pain into purpose. You stopped letting their story define your identity. You stopped performing for approval. You stopped apologizing for having needs, for asking questions, for drawing lines. You realized that healing wasn't about returning to who you were before the betrayal. It was about becoming someone you'd never been allowed to be. Wiser. Sharper, more grounded, more selective with your energy. No longer confused between love and attachment. No longer willing to pour endlessly into people who only offer emptiness in return. And perhaps most importantly, you began to trust yourself again. That's no small thing, because betrayal doesn't just steal our peace, it often steals our self-trust. You start questioning your instincts, your judgment, your own worth. You ask, how could I not have seen this coming? But with time and reflection and unflinching honesty, you learn to trust again. Not blindly, but consciously. You become your own source of validation, and that is when you become untouchable. Not because you can't be hurt, but because you now know what to do with the hurt. You don't run from it, you refine it. And from that refinement, you rise, not as a victim seeking closure, but as a sovereign soul holding wisdom. That's the true revenge, not destruction, transformation. And now your story becomes your strength, not because they were right, but because you refused to let them write the ending. Part 6. The moment you stopped explaining yourself, you found peace. By now, the silence isn't just a response, it's a philosophy, a deliberate act of self-preservation. A quiet declaration that the chapter has ended, not in rage, not in retaliation, but in resolution. And there's something sacred in that stillness. It's not empty, it's full. Full of wisdom, full of clarity, full of the kind of growth that only emerges in the absence of noise. You've come to understand something that few people ever do. That healing doesn't always demand confrontation. It doesn't always look like the climactic moment where truths are yelled, tears are shed, and apologies are given. Sometimes healing is quieter. Sometimes it looks like stepping back, so far back, in fact, that the person who once wounded you can no longer find you. Not because you're hiding, but because you've outgrown the place where pain used to live, and that distance. It isn't avoidance, it's wisdom. Marcus Aurelius in Meditations wrote, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy. That's the essence of your silence. It's not punishment, it's not spite, it's self-discipline." It's the recognition that not every fire deserves your oxygen, not every wound needs to be revisited, and not every relationship deserves a closing speech. Because when you reach this place of inner stillness, you realize some people cannot hear you unless you scream, and by the time you've raised your voice, you've already lost your peace. So you don't raise your voice, you lower your exposure, you reclaim your time, your mind, your soul. And in doing so, you deliver the loudest message of all. I no longer participate in my own suffering. That's what Stoicism teaches, that our peace isn't dependent on whether the world behaves, it's dependent on whether we do. It's not about controlling outcomes, it's about governing our own responses, and when we stop reacting, we start evolving. Seneca, too, spoke often about restraint, about how the wise man is slow to anger, slow to injury, and quick to release what does not serve. And your silence now carries that energy. It's not the silence of defeat, it's the silence of someone who no longer needs to explain their worth to people committed to misunderstanding them. In this silence, you've learned how much noise you used to tolerate, how many apologies you gave just to keep the peace, how often you diluted your truth in order to avoid tension. You thought harmony required self-erasure. You thought loyalty meant always making space for people, even when they brought chaos into your home, your heart, your head. But now you've drawn the line, not with bitterness, but with clarity, and that's what terrifies them most. Because people who depend on your emotional availability as a means of control don't know what to do when you go still, when you stop defending yourself, when you no longer chase or explain or justify. They're left with their own actions and nothing to distract from them. In your silence, they are forced to sit with themselves, and for many, that's the scariest thing of all. Real emotional intelligence, the kind rooted in Stoic thought, doesn't seek dramatic exits or cinematic revenge. It seeks alignment, and sometimes that alignment requires us to walk away from the very people we once begged to stay. You didn't need to prove they were wrong, you just needed to be right with yourself. There's a quiet kind of confidence that comes from no longer reacting, from no longer needing to be understood by someone whose behavior was never rooted in understanding to begin with. You recognize now that closure isn't something they give you, it's something you create the moment you decide to stop bleeding for people who never knew how to heal. And here's the most unexpected part. The deeper your silence gets, the louder your life becomes. Opportunities return, peace returns, your energy regenerates, relationships that are reciprocal start to surface. Because once you create space by letting go of what wounded you, life fills that space with what restores you. You no longer speak to be heard, you speak when it's meaningful, and when it is, you choose stillness. That's emotional sovereignty. It's what Stoicism calls apatheia, not the numbness of indifference, but the elevated calm of one who has trained their passions, examined their judgments, and aligned themselves with virtue over impulse. You're no longer tossed by the waves of other people's storms. You've become an island, steady and self-contained. This is the new you, not cold, not withdrawn, but aware, intentional, unshakable. You've stopped giving emotional access to those who only offered pain in return. And in doing so, you've proven something profound, not to them but to yourself, that you can walk away with dignity, that you can live without vengeance. That your silence can speak volumes, not about what they did, but about who you've become. And in a world that rewards noise, nothing is more radical than peace. Part 7, they can't handle who you've become, and that's the real revenge. And now you stand in the aftermath, not as a casualty of someone else's story, not as a broken version of who you used to be, but as something far more powerful. A creator, you didn't just survive the betrayal, you reshaped yourself because of it. Not into something hardened or jaded, but into someone refined, sovereign, unshakably aware of their own worth. You see, the person you've become wasn't born from applause. They didn't emerge from validation or popularity or the comfort of being constantly understood. In fact, they came forth in silence, while the noise of the world demanded your reaction, your defense, your breakdown. But you didn't give the world that satisfaction. You didn't hand over your dignity for a moment of catharsis. You chose differently. You chose you, and that is no small thing. Because many people waste years trying to win unwinnable battles, chasing closure, proving they were right, seeking apologies from those who only ever spoke in manipulation. but you stopped fighting, not because you lost, but because you realized the cost of fighting was your peace. That was the pivotal moment, the realization that your inner calm was worth more than being seen as correct, that your silence was more powerful than 100 perfectly phrased rebuttals, that your evolution required energy, and that wasting it on chaos meant starving the parts of yourself that were trying to heal. This is the strength Stoicism teaches, not the loud strength of domination or conquest, but the inner strength of equanimity. The ability to remain centered when everything around you tries to pull you off axis. If you are pained by any external thing, wrote Marcus Aurelius, it is not this thing that disturbs you, but your judgment about it. And it is in your power to wipe out this judgment now. What a radical idea. That it wasn't the betrayal itself that defined your path, it was the meaning you gave to it, the frame you chose. And by choosing not to frame yourself as a victim, by resisting the temptation to spiral into bitterness, you reclaimed a truth most people miss. That freedom begins with emotional discipline. And make no mistake, discipline was exactly what it took to get here. It took discipline not to respond to every provocation. It took discipline to resist scrolling through old messages, retracing every memory, trying to rewrite the past. It took discipline to wake up on the days it hurt and say, I'm still choosing peace. You didn't deny the chaos, they tried to drag you into it. They tried to bait you, provoke you, make you react so they could frame you as unstable or dramatic. But instead, you made the one move they couldn't manipulate. You chose not to play, because not every battle is worthy of your energy, and not every accusation deserves your attention. When you live aligned with your values, when you know your truth deeply, Stoicism teaches that you no longer need to explain it to others. Their misunderstanding is no longer your burden. Their judgment is no longer your jailer. That is what sets you free, not their apology, not their remorse. Your detachment is your freedom. And here in the stillness, you've come to see yourself with new eyes. You're no longer just reacting to life, you're designing it. That's what being a creator means. You're designing your responses, your habits, your environment, your relationships. You're no longer pulled into chaos out of old wounds. You're no longer mistaking noise for connection. You're no longer addicted to people who treat your presence like a convenience. You are the architect now, and with that comes a new kind of responsibility, the responsibility to guard your peace, to protect your boundaries, to curate your inner world with the same care you once reserved for others, because you've seen what happens when you hand over the keys to people who haven't earned your trust. You've learned, often painfully, that not everyone who wants access to you deserves it, and now you apply that lesson not with anger but with clarity. This new version of you, it's not aloof, it's not cold, it's composed, it's present. It's powerful in a way that doesn't need to be proven. And yes, this will confuse people. Those who once thrived on your emotional availability will feel the shift and call it distance. Those who once relied on your guilt will call it cruelty. But you know what it really is, alignment. You've stepped into your values. You've chosen integrity over approval. You've reclaimed your energy from the theater of reactivity and redirected it toward becoming, building, healing. In a culture obsessed with shouting louder, you've chosen to live deeper, to rise quietly, to grow without needing witnesses. And ironically, that's what becomes unforgettable. Because while others spent their energy trying to be seen, trying to prove something, you became the person no one could ignore, not because of noise, but because of presence. That's the Stoic path, not the suppression of pain, but the elevation beyond it. And now you walk forward, not as a casualty of betrayal, but as a creator of your own peace. Part 8, when pain is refined into wisdom. The Stoic alchemy of healing. They thought your silence meant surrender, that your absence confirmed their control, but what they didn't count on, what they never imagined, was that your silence was not submission, it was strategy. Not a cry for attention, but a calm declaration. I no longer belong where I am not respected. And as time moved forward, something strange began to happen, not to you, but to them. Without access to your energy, your support, your presence, the very things they once took for granted, they began to deteriorate, not always publicly, not with a dramatic collapse, but subtly, gradually, in the ways that truly matter. Their relationships started to fray. Their reputation, once untouchable, began to show cracks. Their name, once praised, started to carry a shadow, because life quietly and consistently keeps score. This isn't magic, this isn't revenge. It's not the universe conspiring to hurt them, it's simply the weight of character. The truth is, actions don't vanish, they ripple, choices echo. As Seneca said, every guilty man is his own hangman. You didn't need to seek revenge. Because Stoicism never taught vengeance, it taught alignment with reality. It taught you that the only power worth pursuing is mastery over yourself. That when you live with virtue, you allow truth to do what ego never can. Expose what needs to be exposed. You may not have seen their unraveling firsthand, and that's okay. It was never your job to watch them fall, it was your task to rise, and rise you did, but know this. People who betray others to escape responsibility often find themselves trapped in the very cycles they thought they'd avoided, because the problem wasn't you. The problem was within them, and that problem doesn't disappear when they change scenery or social circles. It follows them like a shadow. When they lost you, they didn't just lose someone who cared. They lost access to the mirror that once reflected their better self. And now, all they're left with is their own noise, and no one to blame when it grows unbearable. You became the reminder they tried to erase, and in your absence, you became more powerful than you ever were in presence. Because while they moved on in appearances, they remained haunted in silence. Not by what you said, but by what you didn't say, by your non-response. That is the deepest form of accountability, one that doesn't need to raise its voice. Your restraint became their reckoning, let's be clear. This doesn't mean you wanted them to suffer. True emotional maturity, true Stoic mastery, doesn't dwell in the hope that someone else fails. It dwells in the truth that you no longer need them to succeed. Because once you stop needing validation from people who wounded you, once you release the desire to be seen or vindicated by them, you become unshakable. That's the highest form of revenge, if it could even be called that. Not retaliation, but irrelevance. They wanted you to stay fixated, obsessed, distracted, but you didn't. You transcended. You built a life they can no longer touch. You moved on without the final word, and in doing so, your silence became the final word. And here's where the transformation deepens. At some point, they will remember you, not just in passing, not in nostalgia, but with a gnawing sense of loss. They'll remember how effortlessly you gave, how deeply you cared, how consistently you showed up. They'll look for that in others and never find it replicated, because you weren't a phase, you were a standard, but standards require maintenance, and they weren't willing to meet you there. Now, your memory becomes their teacher. Not because you inflicted pain, but because they finally feel the weight of what they threw away. Not because you cursed them, but because they see your growth in contrast to their stagnation. And that, too, is Stoicism. It's the quiet knowing that your best response to betrayal is not destruction, it's demonstration. Living well, living fully, living aligned with your values. Your dignity becomes your shield, your evolution becomes your justice. Because life doesn't require you to chase karma, it asks only that you walk in virtue, that you trust natural law, that you recognize how cause and effect, though often delayed, is never erased. And as you continue down this path of clarity, peace, and purpose, you'll see how little energy is required to maintain this form of power. You no longer have to carry the past. You've harvested its lessons, extracted its meaning. And now you move forward unburdened, so let them wonder, let them revisit. Let them spin narratives in their head about who you were, who you are, and why they can no longer reach you. You don't need to answer, you don't need to prove. Your silence will always be more articulate than their explanations. You didn't become the villain, you became the lesson. and in time they'll realize that you weren't something they got over, you were someone they were never ready for. Part 9. Silence isn't the absence of words, it's the presence of power. By now, the silence isn't just a response, it's a philosophy. It's your quiet declaration that the chapter has ended, not in rage, not in drama, but in resolution. Because healing, you've discovered, doesn't always require confrontation. Sometimes the most radical act of self-respect is distance. Distance from the narrative, distance from the person who wounded you, and most importantly, distance from the emotional grip they once had on your mind. When you first went silent, maybe it felt like a void, like something was missing. Your instinct might have been to explain, to be understood, to plead your case to people who had already decided not to listen. But with time, you saw something extraordinary begin to unfold, not externally, but internally. Stillness revealed the truth that words once tried to cover up. You began to understand that not all communication is healing. Some conversations are just cycles, loops designed to keep you confused, dependent, reactive. And so you broke the loop, and what emerged was clarity, emotional sobriety, the strength to let people misunderstand you. The freedom to be at peace without being perceived as right. This is a lesson the Stoics understood deeply. Marcus Aurelius said, "When another blames you or hates you, or people voice similar criticisms, go to their souls, penetrate inside and see what sort of people they are. You'll realize there is no need to be racked with anxiety that they hold any particular opinion about you. Let them think what they want, let them talk. You're no longer at the mercy of other people's perceptions. You've risen to a vantage point where external judgment can no longer dictate your internal state. And in that freedom, you realize something powerful. Silence isn't about shutting down, it's about shutting out what no longer serves you. You used to think that setting boundaries meant building walls. Now you understand it means building filters. Filters that protect your energy, your peace, and your time. Filters that allow love in, but keep chaos out. Because when someone betrays you, what they truly betray is the privilege of access. That's what they often fail to realize. The real loss isn't your attention, it's your presence. It's your kindness, your belief in them, your willingness to support them through their own storms. And once that access is revoked, the echo left in its place is deafening. You didn't remove yourself because you were weak. You removed yourself because you were wise. They expected rage, retaliation, a scene. What they got instead was something far more unnerving: your absence, your silence, your refusal to argue. And here's what most people don't understand: that is not avoidance, it's evolution. It's emotional maturity in action. It's you recognizing that the energy you once wasted on being heard could now be invested in being whole. You've stopped playing defense and started creating direction. This shift doesn't go unnoticed, especially by those who thrived on your emotional reactivity. They feel the vacuum, they notice your stillness. And ironically, the more silent you become, the more obsessed they grow, not with you, but with the version of themselves that only existed when they had control over you. But you've outgrown that script. You're no longer the actor in their drama, you're the author of your own piece. And peace doesn't shout, peace doesn't explain, peace simply is. When you walk into a room now, you no longer feel the need to be on. You don't need to prove you're doing okay, you are okay, because you've learned the difference between validation and alignment, and that's a distinction most never make. Let's be honest, there will still be moments of memory, flashbacks. Maybe even doubt. That's not weakness, that's humanity. But now you meet those moments with grace, not guilt. You remind yourself you didn't leave because you gave up, you left because you woke up. You didn't silence yourself, you silenced the noise, and now life feels clearer. Not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer emotionally entangled in other people's chaos. That's the heart of Stoic detachment. Not emotional coldness, but emotional clarity. You still love, you still care. You just no longer confuse loyalty with self-sacrifice. And when people realize they can no longer manipulate your empathy, they call you cold. But in truth, you're not cold, you're measured. You're no longer bleeding just to make others comfortable. You have boundaries now, not because you're building walls, but because you finally understand that your peace is your responsibility. Let that be your new compass, not revenge, not obsession, not even understanding, just peace. And peace, as you've discovered, is built quietly. It grows in the silence, it expands in the stillness, and one day it simply becomes who you are. There's something profoundly unsettling for them about your evolution, not because you gloated, not because you sought revenge, but because you became someone they can no longer reach, no longer predict, no longer use. You outgrew the role they assigned you. You rose beyond the version of yourself that tolerated the noise, the manipulation, the half-truths. And in doing so, you became untouchable, not through arrogance, but through alignment. Your silence became a mirror, not one that reflected who you used to be, but everything they failed to become. And the longer they stare into that mirror, the more they're confronted by the truth they tried to outrun. That your absence was never a punishment, it was the natural consequence of their own actions. You didn't block them to send a message. You didn't expose them to reclaim your narrative. You didn't retaliate to feel powerful. You simply walked away with clarity, with grace, and with a depth of self-respect that no amount of chaos could shake loose. And here's what unsettles them most. You never needed to prove your worth. You just needed to remember it. That's the real victory. That's the final turning point. They thought betrayal would break you, but it rebuilt you into someone they no longer recognize, someone they can no longer reach, and someone they will never get back, not because you're cruel, but because you finally remembered who you are, unshakable, calm, and free.